Curtin FM 100.1 is proud to bring you an interview with four members of the John Barry Seven that were part of the band during what was the group's most successful period, 1959 to 1962. A period that produced such hits as this well-known tune from 1960 that reached number 10 in the UK charts and became the theme for the great BBC TV series Jukebox Jury. Hit and Miss. Miss from the John Barry Seven, featuring the sound of four musicians we'll be speaking with today: Vic Flick, Les Reed, Jimmy Stead and Dougie Wright. First of all, Vic Flick, the great guitarist who played the James Bond theme along with other great instrumentals and who I interviewed last November. Vic, great to have you back on the show.
Oh, hello Mike. Yes, it's good to be talking with you again. I hope you've been looking after yourself.
Sure I have, Vic. Thanks for asking.
That's good. That's good.
The John Barry Seven were always a favourite group amongst us youngsters in the early 60s, but why was there a change of personnel in the late 50s, Vic?
Yeah, the John Barry Seven had always been a good group. I mean, they always got very good reception everywhere they went and everywhere they played. But the trouble was that the guitar players couldn't read. So as soon as John got offered a TV show that he had to accompany other artists, well, he found that he lost it. In fact, he lost a couple of shows because of that, but they went on and did like a star performance, as it were, a guest appearance, but they didn't stay and do the show, and that's, basically is where the money and where the audience gets used to you being around and playing and doing good work. So it wasn't a case of it all changed when I joined. It was just that when I joined, he could take work that guitar players could read, and of course if the guitar player couldn't read, there wasn't much going to happen in those days, back in the end of the 50s and the 60s, because the guitar was like in everything, fortunately.
What was the attraction for you, Vic, in joining the John Barry Seven from the Bob Court skiffle group?
The attraction was work, really. It was good of John to call me and remember me from our meetings when we did the Paul Anka tour, but the fact it was great to be, I didn't see sort of stars and driving around in Rolls Royces or anything. It was just just a case of, oh, great, there's a gig that could develop into something very good.
Thank you, Vic. We're now joined by Les Reed, whose interview you may have heard on this station last October. Very best wishes to you, Les, and thanks for joining us again.
Hello there, Mike. My warmest regards to you too, and all of your listeners on Curtin FM in Perth, Australia.
Les, as a jazz musician, did you have any reservations about joining a pop music band such as the John Barry Seven?
I did have misgivings, actually, because after playing jazz for some time, the oobly-doobly jazz chords I was so used to had no part at all in pop music. It seemed alien to me to revert to simple, basic chords, and for some time I found this to be a difficult task. However, I did persevere and actually came to accept and indeed love the whole genre of pop music. It became an exciting and important part of my life and was the start of my career in pop music. It was a vast business and so exciting. And I think once sort of I got the jazz element out of my mind, then I accepted pop music as indeed, a new venture and certainly something that I wanted to get involved in.
What was the attraction to you of joining the group? Was it the chance of appearing on the TV series Drumbeat, on which the Seven were booked?
Well, apart from the wages, which were very substantial, thank God, yes, the Drumbeat TV series was the starting point for many subsequent TV shows. Fame for the John Barry Seven was assured after that show. We met and worked with many TV pop stars who became great friends and colleagues and became important in my later career, such as Adam Faith, for instance, who acted as my best man to June when we were wed in Caxton Hall in 1960. And who later became a massive recording artist that I had the privilege of playing piano for on all of his hit recordings.
Thanks for that, Les. Let's bring in the Seven saxophone player, Jimmy Stead. Welcome to Curtin FM 100.1, Jimmy. Great to have you on the show.
Hello, Mike. It's really lovely to be on your programme, and I'm really pleased about all of the people out there who like the John Barry 7 of yesteryear. I can only put it that way. Thank you.
In our many conversations in the past, Jimmy, I noticed that you always refer to John Barry by calling him Barry. Why is that?
He was christened John Barry Prendergast. His stage name was John Barry, and he was always called Barry by his friends and working colleagues.
Thanks for that, Jimmy. I note that others also often call him Barry when in private conversation. Tell me, with the amount of touring you did with the band, how did you all manage to move around the country to all the gigs in the late 1950s?
The Seven had a Ford offset side valve van, which was never painted. It was always in the primer coat. And all the band gear, instruments, amps, music, etc., was loaded into that. One of the Seven would drive the van, which had room for 3 people, and the others would travel with Barry in his car. For some of the winter tours, Granada, etc., the promoter provided a coach in which most of the artists would travel and play cards and gamble away the time, and also their money. Once we were booked for the BBC TV Saturday night rock and roll show Drumbeat, we had to live in London, and Mike, Dougie, Dennis and myself rented an apartment in Earl's Court, and eventually we bought our own vehicles and travelled in those. But Dennis and I seemed to team up, and if the gig was in the north, we would stay with my parents, and if it was in the south, we would stay with his parents.
You mentioned that Dougie Wright, the drummer, was one of the guys you rented with in Earl's Court. Time to introduce Dougie, who featured very prominently in the group's 1960 number 11 hit, Walk Don't Run. How was that track recorded, Dougie?
Well, the Walk Don't Run track, I played it on an open drum sound. The drum sound itself was a kind of introduction to the kind of music that was going to happen. The drum sound on the snare drum, particularly, was an open drum sound, as I've just mentioned, and it was produced by taking the damper off the drum completely and letting it ring without any tone control, muting at all. The sound engineer at EMI, Abbey Road, did the thing, and he obviously added possibly he added a little more reverb to the track, and there we are. That's how the introduction was formulated.
Let's listen to some of that track that features your drumming, Dougie. Walk Don't Run. Walk Don't Run by the John Barry 7, and we're talking this morning to 4 members of that great group that had so much success in the early 1960s. Now, you clearly had a lot of kit to move around, Dougie. Did you have a team of roadies at that time?
Well, in the early days, there were no such things as guys to get the stuff around for you. You had to literally do it all yourself. And I was brought up to actually have to cope with that. All musicians did in those days. The semi-pro guys, the professionals. Well, the groups, the big name groups, obviously, which we were, but we didn't have such a luxury. All those luxuries came later. We paved the way. The early guys paved the way for everything, you might say, that followed on to make life easier. But you see, music became much more energetic, if you like, later. more, and it was louder. Everything has become much louder in the business, and the world has become faster as well. But in the early days, the cars didn't go more than 60, 70 miles an hour, and that was it. Started buffeting over that.
Well, the days of buffeting may have gone, but overall the speed's probably slower nowadays. Thanks, Dougie. Vic, why do you think the John Barry 7 had so much success, particularly, of course, as you were the eventual leader?
Yeah, the John Barry 7 was really a good all-round group, instrumental group, and two great saxophone players, Jimmy Stead and Dennis King, and good rhythm section, of course, Mike Peters, Les Reed and Ducky Wright. So it had the potential for doing everything, but of course when that, the guitar sound kind of took over and everybody wanted to hear the guitar. And I play guitar, so everything that John Barry wrote seemed to feature a guitar. It was like Vic Flick 7, but we won't dwell on that one.
Well, I'll be very polite and not push you on that one, Vic. Now, you introduced a number of musicians to the group, Jimmy. How were they selected?
Like many vocational professions, progression in the music industry is in the main via who you know as opposed to what you know. Of course, you would be silly to recommend someone not up to the job. The Seven was a new band and going places. Barry required young, capable, experienced musicians who could read music and would look good on stage. Once I had made my recommendations, each had an audition with Barry, who hired them both.
Looking back at the group overall, Vic, and a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since, of course, you all had to work very closely together. How did all the guys actually get on?
Looking back at those times, well, mostly whenever I think about those, touring and recording with the Seven, it was good times. We were happy. They were good musicians, good to work with. Apart from one or two sort of upsets, which any band has. I mean, I know bands, especially in the big band era, when say the trombone section wouldn't talk to each other. I mean, this went on for like years, and they get off the stand and never speak, never socialise, do anything. But we did have a good team. John Barry, of course, back in those early days when he was kind of happier and more relaxed, he was, unless something went terribly wrong, of course, then he'd do his jumping up and down, I am the band leader bit. But apart from that, no, he was probably the instigator of happiness, because he used to enjoy himself as much as anybody. And certainly, as you say, a lot of water has gone under the bridge, and probably a lot of beer as well. But we won't talk about that.
That could well be the subject of another interview in its own right, Vic. But in the meantime, there seemed to be better opportunities for new musicians in the 1960s, Dougie.
Well, the 60s, late 50s and early 60s were an excellent opportunity for all kinds of musicians, because they were actually getting paid, which sometimes is very difficult now. But apart from the payment side, the making a living point of view, it was great fun, because the whole thing was kick-starting. Popular music as we know it was kind of in its early stages then. And of course it was a great way of seeing the country as well, getting around the place. But the early 60s were very exciting.
Why was that so, Dougie?
Because there were all kinds of young artists coming along in those days. People like the Bachelors, Elkie Brooks, all the Hollies, the Beatles, but we were kind of a forerunner, band-wise, to those groups that were coming along. And of course it was an instrumental band, the John Barry 7.
If the John Barry 7 was a forerunner of some groups to come, what was John like to work with?
John Barry was more fun to work with when we were touring with the Seven and doing these early recordings, because it was kind of all in it together, and if there were a couple of mistakes or the arrangement went a bit wrong or a few wrong notes, then it wasn't a big deal. But as he moved up into the big time, as following the James Bond films and other bits and pieces that he did, then of course he became more serious, and I didn't mix with him socially as much. We got together and talked of old times and stuff, but generally he was much more focused then, and the musicians were a means to an end and the studio was a means to an end. His career came first, and, well, good luck to him.
And very successful, of course, John Barry was. We're talking to Vic Flick, Les Reed, Jimmy Stead and Dougie Wright of the John Barry 7, and we'll be back with part 2 of the interview in just a few moments. We continue our chat with 4 members of the John Barry 7 from the late 50s and early 60s. Vic Flick, who was on guitar, Les Reed on keyboards, Jimmy Stead on saxophone, and Dougie Wright, the drummer. Now, we've been talking about the John Barry 7, Les. What actually was the John Barry 7, in your opinion?
Well, the John Barry 7 was a unique package, really, a kind of a fateful liaison between dedicated musicians and their public. For instance, I mean, Vic Flick, who was really the leader of us all, really stood there with his guitar and played wonderful stuff. He was such a lovely guy and a tremendous guitarist, who was inspired by Barney Kessel in the 50s and 60s. And many years later, Vic became one of my session musicians, and he appeared on virtually every recording I made with Tom and Engelbert, the Fortunes, Pet Clark, and all of those lovely stars. So he was a wonderful addition to our session pool. Jimmy, who played baritone sax, Jimmy Stead, always a lovable guy, a fine sax player and musician, and I understand he's still playing. And it's lovely to hear from him recently, which is great. Now, Dennis King, the other sax player, was a consummate man, deep, very deep, beautiful disposition, and a friend. And he died far too early. He was not very old when he died, and we missed him terribly. Now, Dougie Wright, our drummer, always had a wonderful feel for all kinds of music. And he was enthusiastic, open-minded, and again, I used Dougie on many of my sessions. Now, Mike Peters, the bassist, he was always a gentleman and a scholar, a beautiful guy. And I always remember him saying to me, Les, we're playing all this John Barry 7 stuff. Why don't you do some jazz arrangements? So I did. I did an arrangement of the Dave Brubeck piece, Take 5, which featured Paul Desmond on alto sax. And it was always one of my favourites, but it was in 5/4. And I always remember Mike on concerts after that asking, can we play Take 5? And now and again we would play it, even though the audience couldn't really dance to it because it had 5 beats to the bar as opposed to 4 beats. But I shall always remember he got a bit angry one night at a Christmas do, and just before we were going to play the Queen, he said, let's play Take 5. And Vic, who was leading then, because John Barry had left by this time, said, no, we've got to play the Queen. So the rest of us played the Queen, and Mike played the bass part of Take 5 under us, under the Queen. I don't think the audience noticed that much, but we did. So there we go. That was Mike for you. Lovely, lovely man. Now, John Barry, I have to talk about John because he was a great friend. My first impression of him was a kind of remote guy, but once he got to know you, he was a very warm and good friend. Obvious musical talent, he used the Schillinger method from America, which was no chords, just counter melodies making up the chords. And really, John had not a lot of knowledge in chord work. So we worked behind the scenes together, and now and again I would help him with his chord styles and things for the films. And it was lovely. He would help me in business. So it was a dual thing, really. And we achieved a lot between us. But the end result is that John Barry was a great man.
Thanks, Les. Confirmation that the John Barry 7 were a great group to be in and, of course, to listen to. But they not only recorded their own music, did they, Dougie?
Well, the John Barry 7 was a great backing band, as well as being a group, a solo group as such, doing its own thing. And as a backing band, it was like introduction for us all into the session world, which we were kind of on a learning curve, as they say now, to become session guys later in our careers. And of course we could all read anything that was put in front of us, because sometimes if we were on tour, we were required, the rhythm section in the band particularly, were required to stay on stage all night. So we were seen for 2 hours a night rather than doing our own 35-40-minute slot on a stage. So we were we'd actually got reams of music in front of us on the music stand. So when one artist came on, whether it was Russ Conway, we'd have music for him, then he went off, we'd have the King Brothers, we'd have music for them, then we'd put that down, then we'd have a solo singer, we'd have music for them, or Jerry Dorsey, who became Engelbert, we backed him on stage. All these people had their own music for the backing band to play, and we were the backing band. We were a backing band for so many people, as well as being able to do our own thing. Now, it's quite a unique band that can do that. There are a lot of the other bands that I could mention were just doing their own thing, but they could not sit on stage all night and back other musicians, a la Russ Conway and the King Brothers and people like that. But the thing is, we had great individuals in the band. Les Reed was one of the super musicians we had on keyboard. Piano in those days, Vic Flick, the man who played the theme, the W07 theme. Mike Peters was the bass player. That was the rhythm section of that particular time, which was known as the classic lineup of the John Barry 7 from 58 to 62. And of course we've all done our own thing since then, but we're all steeped in the technicalities and the ability to be able to produce different kinds of music. And so we all moved into the session business, the rhythm section particularly. We did quite well out of the session world, and the rest is history, as they say.
Now, not only did you all move on to other areas to extend your musical talents, but I know one or two of you provided the group with compositions of your own, like this lovely tune called Donna's Theme. The haunting melody of the John Barry 7+4 and Donna's Theme, composed by Les Reed.
My daughter Donna was born in 1961, and I was inspired to write Donna's Theme for her on the occasion of her birth. I also started a new publishing venture called Donna Music, and this theme was the very first copyright to be vested in that company, so she did pretty well out of that. Anyway, after the success of the pizzicato string sound on the Adam Faith recordings, John Barry used the same system for Donna's theme, which works splendidly, I thought, and to this day I still like that track very, very much. Vic Flick played the solo on the main melody beautifully, as well as writing his own little instrumental for the album called Zapata. Nice, it was really nice. So, String Beat, lovely album.
I totally agree, Les. String Beat was a fresh, new and very melodic album. Tell us a little bit more about its background.
Yeah, the String Beat album was lovely. It was, I think, maybe the second album we'd made, this time with strings, the John Barry 7 plus 4, supplemented by 4 violin players led by Sid Margot. This album was inspired by the sound that John had formulated for the Adam Faith recordings with the 7 and the addition of 4 violins, hence String Beat. And it was lovely to do. It really was a nice change from the original John Barry 7 sound.
Thanks, Les. Now, how about rostering and knowing when and where the sessions actually were, Jimmy?
Barry's then-wife, Barbara, gave us a weekly schedule of dates, venues, rehearsals, recording sessions, etc. For recordings, we would turn up at the studio at the required time, set up our instruments. Barry would pass the music to us and bring to our attention anything out of the ordinary. We would then run through the arrangements for everyone's benefit, including the sound engineers, then record the title track once or twice. Barry would pop up to the control room to listen to the recording, and if okay, he would return to the studio floor and we would start again on the next track. In 3 hours, we would record 4 tracks and receive £9 for the full session. Just a thought, we didn't have any time for a photo call to walk across the pedestrian crossings in Abbey Road like some of the future rock and rollers did.
You've just mentioned Abbey Road. Now, I know the track Kid Stuff from the film Beat Girl that starred Adam Faith was recorded there and featured you prominently, Jimmy. Let's hear that track. John Barry 7 and Kid Stuff. What can you remember about the recording, Jimmy?
Thanks for playing Kid Stuff, Mike, but after such a long time I honestly can't remember much of the recording. Perhaps I should, as it was my one and only recorded solo with the 7 on tenor sax. It really moves along, and with solos from Vic and Les, it encapsulates the rock and roll sound. One of my favourites.
How about the Abbey Road recording studios themselves then, Jimmy? How did you feel about that famous place, although clearly not as well known then in the early 60s?
Awestruck. The 7 usually used studio number 2, which was smaller than studio number 1. The control room was located above the studio floor, accessed via a steep staircase. The recording engineers were first class and worked miracles with the basic equipment of those days. I once asked to see their echo chamber, which turned out to be a small bunker soundproof from the outside. Inside, packed with numerous earthenware pots of different shapes and sizes, a loudspeaker located on one side and a microphone on the other side. The echo was magical. No multi-tracking, no digital gizmos in those days.
Here's another track recorded at Abbey Road that featured Ted Taylor on the clavier line, and it's perhaps my favourite John Barry 7 track, Starfire. Starfire from the John Barry 7. We'll be back talking to 4 members of the John Barry 7 in just a moment.